Welcome back to Decarb Connect's podcast. And this week, I'm really pleased to welcome Geoff Mackey from BASF, who is their Group Corporate Affairs and Sustainability Director, and also something of a friend to Decarb Connect because he's a founding council member of our DLN network and always a great supporter. So great to see you here, Geoff. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Good morning, Alex.
So this episode is sort of a bit of a step out of the norm in that this is a sort of combination of looking at what you're focused on, looking at your work with BASF, but also getting a bit of an inside scoop on what COP26 has been like from someone who's been on site, has had their own set of activities and having some really interesting meetings, I'm sure. First of all, I've given the title that you have at BASF, but tell us a bit more, give us a bit of a flavour for your work there, and how have you found yourself doing this work in this space of sustainability?
So the easy questions first, as Spike Milligan used to say. The reality of the conversation is that sustainability is at the heart of what BASF does. And from my side of things, I've been through a whole series of iterations within BASF, and I've finished up in a role that allows me to affect both the actions and thinking of the organization in positive ways. So it's all good from my perspective. Very, very positive about it. Certainly, I didn't plan to be here when I started out. But I think many of us can say that as regards our paths in life. I certainly didn't start out in the chemical industry. A long time ago, my first degree was in ecology, and I had very much a different plan for life. And about 20 years ago, BASF phoned me up and offered me an opportunity, which was too good to turn down. So 20 years later, here I am. I lead on sustainability UK and Ireland, but I also coordinate the Sustainability Champions group across Europe. And that's fantastic because actually BASF is focused on all sorts of sustainability outcomes. And we're moving in the right direction.
Let's have a look at COP then. So for those of us, including me, who weren't up there in Glasgow, haven't been up there in Glasgow, tell us, just give us a kind of the Geoff Mackey description of what has it been like. So we're recording this the Monday of the second week of COP. So what was week one like for you? You know, what did it look and feel like to be there?
Well, I'll have to be totally honest. And week one for me was all about the engagement, the pre-planned engagement for us. I had pointedly shied away from the blue zone in the early part of the week on the grounds that it was full of important people. You can take your view whether or not important people make a difference or not. They obviously do, but there's no point in thinking that anything useful is going to get done at a working level from my perspective. Therefore, I had a whole series of engagements planned in schools outside or in and around Glasgow. We had a number of events planned. I've also been talking with customers, with stakeholders. The green zone was very well attended. The blue zone was really quite interesting simply to get in there. But I'm aware that everybody gets a different feel for COP itself. I also went out for a gentle walk around with the protesters because I think that's another voice in it.
So for you, bit of a combination of some semi-formal meetings, some formal meetings, and then the schools outreach, which is, I think, was a really interesting part of what you were doing. So yeah, just describe that a little. What was the kind of goal of the interactions with schools, and what were you doing last week on that kind of level?
From my side of things, part of the sustainability interaction is not high level. Part of sustainability interaction with my colleagues, my stakeholders, and the schools is to turn around and go, what can we do now? What can we do different? So, for example, we turned up at one school and the school had done a whole series of projects, and one of them was all about no wrap Friday. You know, the snacks that you bring to school shouldn't have any wrapping on them on a Friday. And they presented that to me, and I shared with them some of my thoughts. And we then discussed why we can't do that all the time, or why we can't do that 3 days a week instead of just 1 day a week. And we talked about things that the kids will interact with, because part of the challenge for us is carbon literacy. but it's also science literacy. Because one of the challenges we have in our world today, and with all deference, if I honestly believe you and I are UK based, if you talk to the average person in the street and talk about the difference between 1.5, 1.7 and 2.9, they would have very little grasp of what the practicalities of that actually are. And I think we need to make this real. I think corporates like us can make a huge difference. We've got some massive, massive projects linked to managing our carbon and our processes, our innovations, our sense of direction for us as a seriously impactful business. But then there's the question of what we can do now. And that's for every single one of us. And I still think there's an awful lot of people out there who haven't sat down and thought about what they can do right now.
So when you're talking carbon literacy then with school children, what sort of conversations were coming up? Give us a little bit more of a flavour of how those carbon literacy discussions went.
I think the one thing I've learned in my interaction with education is, number one, my respect for the teaching profession has leapt over the last decade, because the idea of standing in front of 30 young minds and trying to funnel them or focus them on one level is absolutely just the challenge of life. The reality of the conversation for me is when I'm standing there, the kids talking about what we can do and why we can do it. But sometimes they don't always think, for example, how many coats do we have? How many coats do we need? What do you do with a coat when you've finished with it? There's nothing wrong with pre-loved. If we're going to use a bag of some sort, let's make sure we use it again and again and again and again. I think one of the great challenges in our society comes down to things like trends and fashion, because that creates unsustainable directions of travel. And that's something we all need to think about our own buying decisions. And that's part of what carbon literacy is all about.
I joined you for a sustainability day. You mentioned there that you'd also been doing carbon literacy programs within BASF. How do those conversations differ when it's in-house training or an in-house conversation versus what you were talking about in the schools this week?
I would argue that the differences should only be based on the people who are there. I mean, you joined us on one of our sustainability days. Those days are run for as many people and as often as required, because for me, these should not be competitive conversations. These should all be about, we live in a world, we can see the sense of direction. It's not good enough. We can all do better. And therefore, when we're having carbon literacy conversations, yes, of course, for the internal training, we're actually sharing with people openly what we're going to do as a business to manage our carbon, electrifying our crackers, looking at how we actually use pyrolysis, looking at the different conversations regarding biomaterials. These are very, very openly stated senses of direction. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but it's very much a sense of where we're going as a business. And if we can start removing carbon right up at the top end of the value chain, then that means down at the bottom end of the value chain, our customers and eventually their consumers are going to find it an awful lot easier to start dealing with these issues. But it also means people have to know how to make a better buying decision.
Yeah, I think that was one of my takeaways actually from that day that I spent with you and your team. It was kind of an interesting agenda. We were there mostly to talk, I suppose, about decarbonisation through agricultural routes, but also of agriculture in different ways. But it was the discussions around reforestation and how often that's talked about as a very simple kind of, this is a simple win, we'll go plant some trees. But the conversation that you and your team kind of guided us through was, I guess, adding a lot more layers to it and helping kind of flesh out the fact that decisions around that have to be more sensible and more thoughtful than just, okay, I'm going to pay this person to plant some trees for me. And that was just one part of the conversation, but I thought it was interesting to take some of these, standard responses to climate challenges and just unpick them a bit. That was the value for me personally.
And I would certainly argue that one of the rules for those of us who are allegedly informed is to hang ourselves out there and go, right, who wants to talk? Because I want to learn. And going right back to your question about what did I learn from the schools, the answer is be very, very careful when you stand in front of a bunch of 30, 60, 80, 11-year-olds. There was a whole conversation around things like football boots, because actually a lot of football is played. They think about football. That's all well and good. And there's a conversation about how those boots are made and the technology. But then I moved on into things like, do they think about how the pitch is manicured, how things are kept, even as regards the paint used to mark out the pitch? All these were part of the conversations.
What other kind of conversations were you having on site? Can you kind of, again, paint a bit of a picture for that more corporate side of the activity?
Yeah, I don't know of any corporate currently that is not very actively engaged in the world of sustainability in various forms, whatever their frame is. Now, the frame of the UN SDGs is one. There are different frames and ways of looking at sustainability. I'm ever the pragmatic optimist, and therefore my starting point says, if you write sustainability at the top of your agenda, then there's going to be a change. And if you keep on writing sustainability at the top of the agenda, people will keep talking about it, they will keep creating a positive spiral, and we will do better. Now, I'm going to plagiarize Greta's words about blah, blah. Will we do better quick enough? Now, that's a different conversation. And I don't think I'm informed enough to speak to that. But I do think that the negotiations that gone on last week in the Blue Zone and are continuing this week in the Blue Zone, we have seen lots and lots of changes. We have seen lots of countries commit. The comment I would make as a corporate organization is we simply need to understand, and the policymakers need to understand, they have to create an environment for us to work. But we can certainly support the journey forward. And it is not a simple picture, but I am ever the optimist that this will be a good COP.
What came out of either direct conversations you had or the kind of news you were hearing that you thought were signs of life, signs of good, productive routes forward? What jumped out at you from that investor / industrial / corporate news journey last week?
The financial conversation, the way it's been organized, and many of us have got a selection of conversations we like to have with the UK government on a selection of opportunities. Having themed days have given it focus. The financial day created a lot of movement regarding ESG. That was really, really interesting. Certainly, I think the investors are looking long and hard at their metrics. And I'm old enough and ugly enough to go back 30, 40 years and talk about the world of health and safety, where people got killed at work. To be very frank about it, Alex, anybody today who tries to run a business without writing 0 deaths and reduced impacts at the top of their normal operating procedures are out of step with thinking. And I think we're moving very, very rapidly to the same situation with sustainability. Lots and lots of what we're talking about, carbon disclosure, open reporting, big picture metrics that people can see and are openly published. I think that's coming very, very rapidly. And that can only be a good thing, because I'm sorry, I still believe that if I can't measure it, I can't manage it.
You talked a little about what you have done in this last week and the sort of things that you've heard and seen, what do you imagine, or what do you believe is going to find a way into BASF's own strategy from this period of time?
I mean, I would never speak on behalf of my headquarters colleagues to that level. I mean, our sustainability journey is published, it's stated, it's clear. I have little doubt that it'll not be without bumps in the road, but we're going to make a real difference to our carbon management as we move forward. I think the reality of COP is that people will start to understand what some of us have been saying for a lot of years. Though I was talking to a number of people, as you can imagine, last week, and there was one or two grey heads, like me, we've been around a bit. And some of us are feeling that we're almost trendy. We've almost come to our time.
Almost, Geoff, only almost.
Almost, I'm not daft. And the conversation on that one, Alex, is that, we do need to listen to the next generation's voices, but they also have to understand that what they want to create has to be sat down, planned, processed, and created. It's very easy to stand on the outside of the greenhouse throwing stones. You've got to be able to stand on the inside of the greenhouse and keep building in a way that everyone understands as a positive future for all.
What's interesting to me is I do think that this combination of conference of parties, the demonstrators and activists, the kind of much more obvious kind of stepping up of corporates and investors, it's created conversations and a real sense of awareness in family and friends as well as business contexts. I think I wouldn't have expected.
And a positive sense of direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think the one thing that many of us worried about was that this was going to be some sort of political damp squib. And the answer is, and I have to say, I wasn't sure either that having, the global leaders there for the first couple of days was the right answer. But actually, they've waved their flags, they've made their statements. It's all good. Right, Len, sleeves up, let's back to work. And I think that's really, really interesting, because do I think there's going to be one great golden citadel created at the end of COP26? No, I don't, because you can't. It's far too complicated for that. Do I think there's going to be lots and lots of changes, people going away thinking about things? Yes, I do. And part of the conversation has to be the legacy. For every single one of us touched by COP, we have to think about our actions personally and professionally. That will make a change, however large, however small, because I'm really sorry to sound cliched, we are all in this together.
You mentioned a couple of the pillars of your sustainability strategy, so increasing electrification of different operations was one example. When you kind of look at the next 5 to 8 years, say, which is, I guess, what has been more discussion about what happens pre-2030 than perhaps in previous meetings, right? Rather than just long-term goals, there has been more conversation about the next 8 or so years. What's your sense of the sustainability strategy that you're involved with? What do you see changing in the next 8 to 10 years? So it's a short horizon for an industrial, but what sorts of things would you expect to see for your team, for your strategy?
You also mentioned about some of the conversations at COP26. Part of the conversation comes back to what is normal. There are still stakeholders and customers that I come across who haven't wanted to talk about carbon management. There are still people out there who are still talking about stuff they talked about 20 years ago. The world has moved on. And therefore, what do I think is going to happen in the very short term? I think the opportunity for education, for dialogue, for open discussion about all the topics around what is sustainability and what it means is all about part of this conversation. And whether you start from a principle of, reuse, recycle, upcycle, or whether you start from a principle of don't use it at all those positions are valid. What's important is you know where you're at right now and you move to somewhere different on a positive level. And we all move as often as we can and as hard as we can. And that will make a difference.
Are you able to share what you expect to see your company pushing forward in the next 8 years? For example, are there elements of electrification where like, yes, this number of plants or this percentage of operations? Is it easy to articulate in that way?
I think the electrification of our crackers is a technological step. And the question of biomaterials is another one. One of the big steps is renewable energy. Because I think if you look at any of the publicly available figures, availability of renewable energy is going to be a real challenge. And there are different parts of the world and different parts of Europe where that will be a bigger challenge. I had a number of conversations with people in and around the Scottish policy establishment last week. And the reality is the UK has got wind onshore and offshore. You know, the UK has got wave, however much we laugh about it, we have got solar. And we really have to think about our energy mix and how to use that. Because as we start to electrify our transport and frankly, electrify our lives, not using fossil fuel as the starting point is a huge step in that. But then you immediately run into all sorts of conversations around the choices we also make. You know we can make 2 bottles of shampoo, one out of trees and one out of fossil fuel. They are molecularly identical. The challenge is to make those value chains work and make the consumer understand the difference.
Okay. Well, good. Lovely to talk to you as ever, Geoff. And I mean, I wish I could have been a fly on the wall for some of those school sessions.
Scary place to be. It really is. You don't get more open than standing in front of 11-year-olds because the answer is they just have questions.
Well, I'm sure you handled them well, and I'm glad you got so much out of it. It really sounds like you've kind of balanced your time there so well between the kind of formal discussions, but also this outreach to schools. Good to talk to you today, Geoff. Thanks so much for joining us.
Alex, thank you very much. Always a pleasure.
Many thanks for listening to the Decarb Connect podcast. We work with clients across the industrial sectors, specifically those who are tasked with decarbonising the most energy-intensive products and materials that we use every day. If you have an interest in learning more about either our members network, our reports, or our event series, do get in touch with us at decarbconnect.com. Or if you'd like to take part in the podcast, email me, alex@ac@decarbconnect.com. Thanks for listening.